Good afternoon. Today is Wednesday, April 24th, 2019. This is the special meeting of the Citizens Finance Advisory Committee and the Citizens Oversight Committee. Our regular monthly April meeting was postponed, so we are meeting today instead of our normal third Tuesday. So I'd like to call this meeting to order. We have a quorum here with all members in attendance except for CFAC members in attendance except for Bill Bose. And I'll call the meeting to order. We will rise for the pledge of the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. We'll have a short moment of silence, please. All right, thank you. Are there any committee members that have any announcements to make from CFAC? Dave? No. Lois? No. Myself, no? No? No. All right, then we will proceed. Is there any public comment for any members of the audience wishing to address the committee on any business matters not on the agenda or those for which you cannot stay? All right, seeing none, close public comment. Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, staff. Thank you for coming. And we will begin with the consent calendar, which item A1 is approval of the minutes from last month's CFAC meeting that was held on March 19th, 2019. Has everybody had an opportunity to review those and make sure we don't have any corrections or anything? All right, then I'll take a motion to approve those minutes.
Also move.
Thank you, Lois. Second, please.
Second.
Okay, so the motion was made by Lois and seconded by Homer to approve minutes A1 consent item. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? 6-0 carries. Thank you. All right, that brings us to item business items. Item B1 is the discussion and input on the 2019-20, that would be next fiscal year beginning July 1st of 2019, the proposed Measure Q budget. So I'm going to turn it over to, all that is in your agenda packet. We discussed some of it in quite a bit of detail at last meeting, but now we're ready to approve it. The proposed budget. Jennifer, do you have any preliminary comments or summary on that, please?
Yes, thank you. I'm just going to go through quickly what's included in the budget. Again, we talked pretty extensively about it at our March meeting, so I don't think there's any surprises in here that should be unknown to the committee. Just to start off, we do have our fire marshal Matt is here, our police chief, support services manager, and our public works director, so they can answer any questions you have if you do have any. We have not gotten any new revised sales tax updates from HDL at this point, so we're still using the most recent updates of about $1,096,000 for Measure Q sales tax revenue. We honored the committee's recommendation to keep a minimum of $500,000 dedicated towards pavement for the fiscal year, and kind of worked around that number with the other departments. So just to kind of briefly go through individually what those expenditures are for, there's $483,000 allocated to the fire department, $183,000 for salaries and benefits. We have switched out the dedicated personnel to Measure Q for the lowest paid fire engineer, and understand that's by the resolution, so we've made that change. There's $122,000 transfer into the general fund to support the relief and overtime to maintain that 4-person staffing. The debt service is $90,000, and that includes the bond indenture reserve component. So not all of that will be spent. Some of that will feed into fund balance at year end as a set aside for the reserve. PP&E, the personal protective equipment, $16,800, $14,000 for the cardiac monitors, and then $56,250 for the repayment plan of the fire engine. And there was a question on that, and we did make that correction. It's a 4-year repayment plan to the General Fund Emergency Reserve. That was adopted by Council in August in lieu of doing financing to purchase that fire engine. For the police department, the $24,000 in standby pay, $23,000 for body-worn cameras, $20,000 for first responder kits, and then $20,000 for payment to the SLO County Sheriff's Department for the gang, bond, and narcotics task force. And that's consistent with prior years. And lastly, for Public Works, we have the final year of the skid steer lease. That'll end in February for $20,000, and the remainder is listed as pavement management plan. Just as a reminder, that's actually going to be transferred out to the capital project for pavement management. So you'll see that amount as a transfer, but we do consider it under the Public Works portion of this budget. And then on E3 of your proposed budget, we highlight the unassigned fund balance. This matches with what's in our audit. We're projecting year-end 18-19 fund balance of $147, assigned about $49,000, and that's that indenture for the USDA loan on the fire station. That leaves you about $98,000 of unassigned fund balance. Just as a reminder, while we're speaking about the USDA loan on the fire station, the property at Coral Ave that's in repayment, that's been held up at the Coastal Commission on appeal. So we haven't received the final payment yet, and when we do, we'll come back with a discussion item on that. For the new committee members, there was intention for that payment to be put towards or applied towards the remainder of the loan on the fire station. We may have a conversation about, given the interest rates, if that makes sense, or if we should use it to pay down PERS, which has a higher interest rate, and we'll bring back some numbers for the committee to consider, but that's likely several months out at this point. So I'm just going to pause there, and maybe we can talk about Measure Q separately before moving on to the rest of the budget.
No, I agree. So thank you for that. Thank you for keeping the 500K in the pavement. That went up to 505K, it looks like, because 5,000 went down on the skid steer payment, if I'm not mistaken. That would be the last. Okay. And thank you, all of you, for answering all those questions in detail in advance of the meeting. I've reviewed everything, so does anybody have any questions or further comments on the Measure Q, or are we in agreement with this proposed budget? So I'll start.
I have a question.
Oh, please, Dave, go ahead.
Will the city own the skid steer after this final lease payment? Yes. Or is it going back to the leasing company?
It was a lease to purchase kind of agreement, so we would own it.
Okay. What's the replacement schedule on that piece of equipment? Is there a replacement schedule on it? Or what's its remaining lifespan estimate?
With our heavy equipment, we basically run them until the wheels or tracks fall off. But on that type of equipment, probably 15 years is what you would look at the book value for a replacement. We'll probably keep it in service longer than that, though. So it probably has 10 more years of service life left in it after the retirement of the lease payment.
If I can just kind of piggyback off of that, and we're going to touch on this a little bit when we move into the general fund budget, but part of our fee study update that we hope to have completed and bring forward to council at the end of May, they're building replacement schedules for our equipment for us, and then we can start accumulating annually towards that. So it's a good reminder to make sure that piece of equipment is on that replacement schedule and we start accumulating for future replacement of it.
Thanks, Dave. Lois, any? Thank you. Homer?
I don't have a question, but I've got a suggestion. I'd like to see half of the unassigned be transferred to the pavement management plan. That way, public safety and streets would have basically an equal portion of the funds that are available. The other half of the unassigned, I would leave where it is, and the city council can discuss that during their mid-year budget, depending on how the sales tax revenue comes in through the fall.
Thank you for that comment. John?
Just, Homer, we haven't had a chance to talk about this, I wish we had, but the thing with Measure Q is that the city doesn't receive the sales tax money from the state for May and June until the following fiscal year. So if you fall much below that amount in the fund balance, you actually end up with a negative cash on June 30th.
And
Ms. Jennifer, can you address that, please?
so the implication to that then is when we assign interest, it's based on ending cash balance, and you would have a negative cash balance in your fund to do that. But in and of itself, we'll accrue it back, so it might not be a problem, but that's one of the points to consider in doing that.
Okay, Bart, any comments? All right, so Homer is suggesting, and we have done this in the past with the unassigned fund balance, and typically we put it all in the PMP because that's been so shortchanged for so long. So that's 98, what is that, 49,002 something?
Yeah.
You're proposing that we not wait till, or we recommend by June?
Well, I'm not sure when the next pavement projects are going to take place, Mr. Lavick.
So we will ask for input from Mr. Liveck to help us.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander, Madam Chair. Likely, we will change our strategy for going out to bid. We're going to go out to bid this year. We're at the end of our multi-year contract with pavement coatings and go out to bid probably end of winter so that we have a springtime paving schedule so we don't run into the same issues we've had for the past 3 years in trying to start a paving or a resurfacing project in October, November, just when it starts to rain and have things delayed and stretch out over the entire winter time. The other reason for that is there's another cycle of rubberized asphalt grants coming up that could be awarded in April of next year, but it wouldn't count for any projects that started before that. So we're hoping to take advantage of the Cal Recycle grants cycle again next year, which would add probably another $50,000 to the available funds.
So basically, you're not spending any money until next spring.
Only design work would be
Okay.
spending money on.
So if we do move half of it, each public safety would receive 570,000, and streets would be a little bit more than that. Basically be equal.
If you would like to include in the proposed budget use of fund balance, we will not actually fund the pavement management project until end of year. So we won't make a transfer until June-ish of 2020.
John, is that okay?
Well, I just don't think it's wise to end up with negative cash in any of the funds if it's avoidable. So I would recommend that that amount of fund balance be retained.
Okay.
Well, if it's not going to get moved till June 2020, this may be a future recommendation then, when we get a little closer to see what the balance is. All right,
We
so-
can bring it back at mid-year too
Yeah.
for discussion at that
Yeah.
point.
Just trying to get a couple more blocks paved.
And keep the visibility of it, but it's a great suggestion, and thank you if you will put that on hold, Jennifer, and bring it back. That'd be perfect. All right, so for item B1, then the recommendation is receive it and provide feedback. Our feedback is basically we are in agreement with the proposed Measure Q budget. All right, so we don't need any motion or anything further on that, I don't believe.
And we'll share that with the council at our first budget study session in May.
Yeah. I may need to end up summarizing some of this and getting you something before the next council, and I'll be happy to do that. But for B1, it's check, we agree, and other than the recommendation to bring something back mid-year with the unassigned balance, which should be updated at that time too, presumably. All right, so let's move on to B2, discussion and input on the draft proposed, the operating budget, 2019-20. We did have a lot more questions on these. Thank you so much, all of you on the city staff, for answering those quickly over the holiday weekend. And I'm not going to go through it page by page. I trust all of our members have indicated they've reviewed the budget, and unless there's any comments or questions or a few things we may want to discuss a little further, we'll start with that. Do you have some preliminary comments for us?
I kind of did a kind of a general overview highlights, if you want to go through that quickly.
That'd be good. I'm
Kind
okay
of
with
address
that.
a little bit how we balanced from that $325,000 deficit that we talked about at mid-year, or at, February mid-year. So it's included in your PowerPoint. If you keep flipping through your pages, there's a $14.8 million in revenues that consists of $13.4 million in actual revenues coming in, $1.4 million in transfers, and that's offset by expenditures of $14.8 million. So we do have a proposed balanced budget. Overall, the theme, we were very cautious with this budget. No new positions were added, even if they were cost neutral, except for the SRO position. And again, that's fully funded by the school. And then generally, the budgets were status quo. And what we meant by that is we went through and calculated our personnel costs with the increased pension and OPEB, and then asked departments to the best of their ability, keep their operating budgets or their bottom line budgets the same as the current year. So there was essentially a reduction in operating expenses. A few exceptions here and there as we got all of the budgets back in and realized what we had to work with and what we could fund from a safety perspective for our employees. The highlights of the budget, I talked about this in March, that the COLAs, we do expect to meet the triggers that are in our MOUs, so we forecasted the COLAs for our employees. That's 2% for SEIU and fire and police. We've included our increased PERS costs as well as our OPEB costs that we expect to incur. We have funded the Black Hill repeater as a one-time cost at about $31,000. Radios that will work off that repeater site for both police and fire at $26,000. The weapons simulator that we had presented to the committee for consideration with Measure Q, we've worked that into the general fund budget. Well, it's a $7,000 purchase. The ombudsman and the chamber. This is in the city manager's proposed budget. It's really to support economic development with either extension of collaboration with the chamber and or a ombudsman contract position. And then another economic development. This is two separate pools of money, if you will. We're proposing to establish a new fund. Annually, our community development department has had $100,000 in their operating budget for general plan implementation. That's varied year to year on what that's used for and what type of implementation items are done. However, at year end, if that's not used, it gets swept into excess revenues over expenditures and goes into our emergency reserves. So by setting up this new fund, they will maintain a fund balance in there, and there will be money available to continue with economic development activities. So instead of $100,000, we're proposing a $65,000 transfer for those implementation items. That is combined with a carry forward of what we expect not to spend this year of that $100,000 of about $75,000. About $140,000 in total will be for, again, implementation items, primarily wayfinding for next year. It'll be the completion of wayfinding, as well as some online tools for development that can be accessed from our website. We've also have, I lost my page, reduced contribution to TBID. This was discussed with the council and then with the T-bid board last week or a couple weeks ago. We've put in a placeholder of $60,000. After discussion with the T-bid board, they're recommending $75,000. So we're discussing about what the staff's recommendation would be and how we would close that gap if we were to proceed with the $75,000. It would likely be use of money from the project accumulation fund or one of the other funds that we have some fund balance in at this point. And that will be discussed with council in more detail in May for their recommendation. We had a surprise the last week of putting this together, that the fire dispatch contract with the county was reduced by $70,000. It was originally $123,000. The reason more agency joined, 5 cities joined that contract, so we were able to spread the costs among more agencies. So that was a little bit of a surprise. We've also used the most recent updated cost allocation plan figures. Cost allocation, again, is the overhead or administrative overhead that funds such as our water and sewer, our utilities funds, pays to the general fund for admin support, processing payroll, processing bills, city manager oversight, etc. If those numbers are changed substantially or updated, we expect to get a final report next week. We'll go through and update those in the budget, but we've put those in at this point as placeholders. And then we have not built in any increases for revenues that may result from that fee study. Again, we expect to bring that to council at the end of May for the first time discussion. Would hope to have some community outreach on any implications that those revenue increases or proposed revenue increases may have. Come back in June, July for adoption, and then 60 days after that it'll go into effect. So we're looking at a September-ish, October timeframe to start seeing any changes to the fees from this fee schedule. As the chair pointed out, we've had several questions that were received. We did provide answers to them all the budget-related questions. Happy to follow up on any of those. There was a point made about transfers and maybe discussing those a little bit. Both from a revenue and an expense side, there's a significant amount of transfers that are incorporated and ultimately help to balance the budget. Again, those transfers are cost allocation plan, administrative oversight for various funds that don't directly pay towards those functions. Our gas tax money is transferred in to help offset work we do on roads, and that's specific to what we can use that for. And then we transfer money out to T-bid, for example, and other agencies. So if there's any specific questions, we can go through those detail by detail. And then it begs the question of how did we close that gap? How did we balance when we were projecting a deficit of $325,000? This is a very rough chart that kind of outlines that. I didn't get down to the penny because there were some increased revenues, decreased expenses, but it came close, and I just wanted to give you a general idea. Primarily, we did not fund internal service funds, vehicle replacement, capital fund, anything in excess of facilities funds. We have just a $10,000 transfer to support kind of unknown things such as heaters going out or something like that. And we have a reduced contribution to our technology fund. Most of that was made up by some of the updated cost allocation plan numbers where other funds were contributing more to IT than we had previously charged them. So the general fund contribution was less. That made up a substantial portion of the deficit. In addition to that, we talked about the fire contract coming in at a surprise at the end, saving us about $50,000. Police staffing, because of the SRO position being funded by the school, and then we had another retirement of a senior officer. Both of those positions are backfilled by entry-level positions. So that saved about $60,000 at the end of the day. We're proposing to use the remainder of the money in the Opportunity Fund to help support the economic development funded in the city manager's budget, the chamber relationship, and the ombudsman. And then again, the reduced contribution to T-bid, as well as the general fund's reduced contribution to general plan implementation items. Again, that went from $100,000 to $65,000. So all in all, that gets you right around $350,000 in savings, and we were projecting about 325. So there were a few other offsets in there that I didn't get down to that detail, but that's essentially how we balanced. The revised cost allocation numbers that we have right now actually were a significant decrease to the general fund at $250,000 about that. So we had to make up a little bit more than that 325 that we were originally projecting. So we kept keeping tally as the numbers were coming in and to where we were going to end the year. Because we're not funding our internal service funds, we did adopt a resolution recently on revenues and expenditures. New revenues are to be treated as one-time revenues for the first 24 months in order to establish that they are going to be consistent and reliable revenues. Again, that's by council policy. So our thought is when we start to receive cannabis tax money, when the 2 cannabis medical marijuana shops open up, our recommendation will be to fund some of those internal service funds initially up to the target funding levels. So as that money comes in, we'll come back to council with some recommended uses of that. And also we are waiting on the replacement schedules that I mentioned earlier. Those are being built as part of our fee schedule. So that will include IT replacement, vehicle replacement, facilities replacement, and we'll get better refined numbers on those needs as well.
Can you pause there for a minute, please? Okay, thanks. You're going very fast, which is good. I don't want to delay it, but on the cost allocation plan, if you could give a little elevator speech on that. I've been hearing about that for a couple of years, that it wasn't updated, blah, 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 and we have some new members. So what exactly is it, so those in our audience or watching on TV or here, understand that CAP?
I believe the last time the cost allocation plan was updated was about 2009, maybe about 10 years ago, if I'm remembering correctly. And again, that's the kind of the administrative oversight. So our city manager does not charge time, for example, to water or sewer or the treatment plant. So it accounts for any oversight time he spends on that. It accounts for our Valerie, who processes our payroll, to process payroll for the employees in those departments. Sandy's doing journal entries for that. It accounts for time we spend processing bills, doing any kind of financial support to those departments. Kind of the HR support, operated out of Dana and Lori's staff. All of that administrative overhead, and it's built off of a schedule. It goes through, breaks it down to the cost of electricity to run City Hall, and then that's divided between the general fund programs, all of our other funds, and they're each assigned an amount to support that.
Okay, so in the private sector, we would probably call this corporate overhead or G&A, general and administrative, and it's a way of, it's more specific accounting, but it's a way of charging back those costs. If the city manager or the person doing the journal entry spends a whole lot of time one month on one particular enterprise fund, it's a good way to make sure that that's reflected in their costs.
Absolutely.
Okay, everybody got that? Thank you. Okay, go ahead, I'm sorry. Anything else on that before we?
Just a few little wrap-up items. So outstanding items that you are going to receive in your next submittal. Last year at this time, you had only received the Measure Q and the general fund pages, so we've elaborated a bit more this time in the other funds and the internal service funds. We still owe you financial summaries. That'll be distributed in a couple weeks with the next distribution, and you'll have a chance to comment on that in May. We're breaking that out, hearing the committee's comments about transfers. So I've given you a little snippet of what we're trying to do. Only for 1920, on the revenues and expenditure summary, we'll highlight what is actually a revenue. The next column will be the transfer, and then it'll be a total. So hopefully that will help clarify that point. We do need to add a community benefit fund page. That was the money for Tri-W, that $250,000 that came in as a community benefit. So we'll be including that. The transmittal letter, the capital budget, and the summaries for the capital budget, the reference section, and we're attempting to do a city profile section this time as well. few dates. We'll be distributing the next packet May 3rd. That will go to council and give them 2 full weekends to read that before the first budget study session on May 14th, 3:30. Our next study session is on May 16th, and we're going to try to change that to 4 o'clock. And then on May 28th at 4 o'clock with budget adoption, tentatively scheduled for June 11th.
Thank you. All right, John, did you have a question or comment,
I
please?
did, yeah, in regards to the cap. Is that something that comes to the council for approval?
Yes, it'll be incorporated into the fee study discussion at the end of May.
Okay, and is that also something that the auditor looks at when they do their work at the end of the year?
In my experience, I haven't had an auditor ask to see that. I suppose it would be subject to if they wanted to do testing on that. Everything in there would be defensible, or, you know, our contractors indemnified for that, but it would be subject to audit.
Okay, thank you.
Did you mention that the new plan was about 25% less than the previous plans for the four departments that were overcharged?
I don't know if I would say overcharge. It is less because we have broken out components related to building. We're going to put those in the building fund. We've taken out IT money and put that in IT versus before it all went into general fund for support that way.
Right. I just not sure everybody realized that it's almost 200,000 less.
225, I think.
Yeah. And then you made part of that up by adding a overhead expense to the Morro Bay Cayucas wastewater treatment plant.
That was a discussion item we had at the staff level last year as to why we didn't have that for the treatment plant. And when we received the draft report this year, there was a cost allocation for that plant, and did include it about $157,000. The plant fund itself owes that to the general fund.
Right, split roughly 75-25.
Correct.
And when were you planning to discuss the 25% with our folks up north?
So we, as a matter of practice, send them the budget for comment and review. Since we're doing some minor cleanup and getting that, the enterprise funds put together now, we should be doing that early next week. We're going to try to recommend a meeting and a formal approval of that. In the past, they haven't taken us up on that, so.
Oh, another JPA meeting. Haven't had one of those in 3 or 4 years.
We can only ask.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, what other comments and questions on any of the budget that Jennifer or staff can answer? Dave, did you have anything?
Well, I just have a general comment. I wanted to compliment you, Jennifer, and the staff that put together this operating budget. I really like the information that's in here. I think it really tells a story of what the various city departments do, what their purpose is, their accomplishments, and their goals for the next fiscal year. I think it really tells a tremendous amount of information that the public can use, and it's very accessible. And again, I compliment you on that. I think it's a huge change from what I've seen when I first started on this committee. So, good job.
Yeah, thank you. This is definitely a full team effort. Every department has people working on this and getting information, and Sandy and Val and the whole finance team are dedicated to this. So it's a lot of time, the goal being that it's helpful, useful, and the community knows where your money is being spent and what it's being spent on.
Agreed, you're not the only one that commented on that, so thank you.
I think you accomplished that goal.
Yeah.
It's terrific. I like it.
I agree with that part, clearly a continuation of last year, because I think that was basically our comments last year, and this is basically tweaking that, so huge change. Am I missing something as far as the front pages of this that would have this summary? Because you're going into now explaining how you balanced a budget, and I don't recall, have we seen this before? The document that you basically, the $350,000?
No, and you don't have financial summaries yet. You'll get that in May. Those are very hard to compile together without having the rest of the enterprise funds done, because I can't tell if they're balanced or not. So we're finalizing those. It will be included in the May 3rd publication when we send that out for council to start reading. The chart of how we've budgeted or how we've balanced in and of itself won't be in the financial summaries. We'll talk about how we've done that in the transmittal letter and then in the presentation. The financial summaries, you're going to get a summary of all of the citywide revenues and expenditures broken out with transfers, how those are split between salaries and benefits, supplies, services, capital purchases, debt service. You'll get that for citywide, all the funds, and then a separate breakout for the general fund.
So I like to start from the top and work down. This provided, I didn't get to see what the big picture was, and this solves the big picture. So I don't know.
Yeah.
We're aware of the issue in general, obviously.
Right.
And I wasn't sure if it was 325 or a bigger number, because it seemed like there was some other issue that was kind of making it possibly more. More detail, though, at some point. I mean, this is a huge deal, and as Barbara said, you went through it pretty quickly, very well, but it's pretty significant to make sure we understand all of this, and $250,000 or basically do a reallocation study is a big number, you know, and, you know, I clearly think it ought to be part of an audit. It's probably ripe, I think, to go on record to have somebody look at something like that when we're moving $250,000 into, I guess, the capital projects that were not being allocated properly. I'm not arguing that. I understand that's what you're saying. If I get what this CAP is doing.
Yeah, let me clarify it a little bit. So let me think of our water fund. Let's use our water fund. Pays the general fund, let's say $100,000. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. For the finance support, HR support, city manager support, all of those overhead support items. That is being supported by the work done by our consultant that's on board, and there's a document that is going to be produced that shows how he got to that number. So what the auditors would likely ask for is to see a copy of that document, and they have all the support behind that. In the past, we had included items in there for building maintenance based on the old schedule. Not that that's wrong, but we're breaking those out now into separate funds, so we're accumulating separately. In the future, if there's a water truck that's needed, it goes into the water equipment replacement fund, and that money is there for that. So we're just trying to separate them out more with the updated schedule. Typically, cities go through and do that every 5-ish or so years. Structure changes, organizational structure changes. You know, we no longer have a deputy city manager, for example. That may have been allocated out in the past to if they were providing oversight. So we always want to go through and update those. We're going to have a functional model at the end of this where next year we can go in and make adjustments for any changes that happen from a staff level. We can include increases to salary and benefits, for instance, the COLAs, changes in our PERS rates, so it'll constantly be updating and be accurate every year.
Okay, one of the examples you used was Scott, and I recall a discussion at least 6 months ago was that you had looked into how you were, and I think you used yourself as an example of how your time was being charged to make sure that it appropriately went to these other projects. So I would have thought that happened already. And now you're using a similar example as why we weren't doing it. So did we not make all the changes we should have made when you looked at your timekeeping and how it was being allocated?
So maybe we're talking about two different issues. With the wharf project separately, we all charge our time independently to that. So every hour I spend, I charge to the wharf, so there's no confusion about anything. Same with Scott. Anytime he spends in discussion or working on that, we charge that directly to that project. These are for operation of the water fund, the operating fund, the utility billing. The staff at the front counter at City Hall has allocation of time that's charged to those departments, so they're not put into the cost allocation plan. My time is not charged to the water department at all. It's captured through the cost allocation plan. When the consultant came in, we sat down with him and went through all of the city functions, general fund, non-general fund, and broke out our time. How much time, for how many payroll checks do we process? Val went through, figured out how many checks she processed, how many employees are there in the water fund, and then a percentage of her time is allocated based on the number of payroll checks she's processing for water employees. So that's how we capture that, and that was the detail I think we were talking about back then, if I'm remembering correctly.
Okay, so this is different.
They're two different.
These other funds, so when you looked at one, the bells didn't go off to say, oh, maybe I better look a little bit broader, and now you're doing that.
Right,
Okay.
Almost like the difference between direct and indirect expenses,
exactly.
basically. Thank you. Okay, John.
So on the cap, you're going to have a functional model, which means that you're going to be doing that internally from now on and not hiring a consultant?
I would recommend that we would probably still want to do updates every 5 to 8 years, but in the interim, we'll be updating. In the past, we were updating by CPI and not to the detail level, but we're going to try to do that internally to get more accurate numbers.
Okay. Couple other questions. I believe you submitted last year's budget or the current year budget to GFOA for their budget award. Have you heard back from them?
We submitted to CSMFO
Okay.
for their budget award, and we did receive the Excellence Award, outstanding, not sure which one.
Congratulations.
So we'll have that in the next distribution, right in the front, for everybody to see.
Good, good. You also mentioned OPEB. How do you fund OPEB out of your regular budget?
This year was the first year, and Sandy and I had a conversation about it. We went through and used the percentages for our GASB entry at the end of last year to estimate what the OPEB cost would be for this year. In the past, we hadn't done that, so that's actually a significant advancement in this budget to actually account for OPEB in our salary and benefits
Okay, and
section.
so you're actually making cash contributions to who?
Mm-hmm.
To where?
A trust fund.
A trust fund, okay. So I noticed also again that this year you're not budgeting for any kind of interest income. And with the rates being what they are now, you're probably looking at somewhere between $300,000 and $500,000 of income next year. Is there a certain point where you do start budgeting for interest income, or is that just a city policy that you just don't do it no matter what the rates are?
So I'm going to maintain that by practice, I would not probably ever budget for interest income. It's spread out against all the funds, so maybe as a total 400,000. The general fund's not going to get 400,000 in interest. And then I would caveat that further by saying next year, we expect to have substantial cash output for the wharf project, depending on the inflow from the WIFI or whatever financing we use. I'm not sure we will get that amount of interest, depending on, cash flow timing.
Okay, so even if interest rates go to 8%, you're still not going to budget for interest?
If we're forecasting expenditures of 30-ish million for the wharf, there's going to be a lot of inflow and outflow of cash that would impact our interest earnings.
Okay. At some point, I think it becomes material, but, yeah. One other thing I probably should have asked when we were talking about Measure Q, one of the items this year was for $14,000, I think, for the fire department to get a grant for fire radios. Does that ring a bell?
The 14,000, I think, was the cardiac monitors in Measure Q. They are looking to get a grant to purchase, I think, additional ones. They need so many, and that funds, I have to go back and look at the detail.
I didn't bring the current budget with me, but something in my weak memory tells me it was for some kind of a grant for radios.
Replace 12-year-old cardiac monitors with a Measure Q request of $14,000 and replace 4 programmed monitors that are 5 years old.
Yeah, I'm talking about the 18-19 budget.
Oh, this year?
Yeah, last.
There was matching funds for replacement of, they might have been radios. They didn't get the grant, though, so that money is not being funded.
Okay,
spent.
that was my question.
Yep.
So that money's not going to be spent?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Homer, go ahead.
I had some questions, or no, they're not questions, suggestions about a couple items on the transfer page, C46.
Okay.
This is my personal opinion, but I think the $60,000 that's being allocated for tourism could be greatly reduced or eliminated, and some of those funds could be used to fund the capital of the vehicle replacement fund or put in the reserves for future CalPERS expenses. That money coming from the general fund has traditionally been used to support events. And the whole purpose of it is to provide seed money for for an organization that wanted to try a new event. Get them enough money to get it going, 1 year or two at the most. In 2014-15, it was $40,000. In 2015-16, it was $0. The event still took place. In 2016-17, it was $60,000. Several of those organizations that received the money use it to pay the city fees. That seems silly to me. You're just moving general fund money from one pot to another. Some of those organizations, not all those organizations are 501c3s. Some are other Cs, and one or two are private enterprises. So I'm not sure about funding private enterprises with taxpayer money. Some of the money's been used for an event planner. I don't understand why the boards of the nonprofits can't organize their own event. I realize this isn't going to go anywhere because of the resolution that's out there, but at least I wanted to say it. My suggestion would be that the city council establish some sort of criteria for who gets funded. As an example, only 501c3s would be included. The event must have demonstrated some benefit for the city. And events that charge admission should be excluded. I mean, if they want more money, they just raise their ticket price $1 or something. Anyway, I just wanted to get that out there, realizing it probably won't go anywhere. The other point I wanted to make about the transfers, and this is not all in the transfer thing, it took a little time to figure out, but in the next fiscal year, the city's planning to spend $202,000 on economic development for 3 different projects. And I would hope that the proposals for each of these projects would include a quantifiable way for measuring the results. This will be the second year of the 3rd project in the last 5 years for economic development. And based on the revenue projections that you've earlier just demonstrated, I have a hard time understanding where the return on investment on that money has produced. And I'm sorry to get off my soapbox, but that's all I had to say.
So I guess before we proceed, do you need any clarification of that, or do any of us, I think Homer's tried to explain some of his justification, but if Jennifer, Scott, or somebody wants to make a couple comments before I ask my committee members?
So let me just, and I'll do you want to go first? Okay. As far as the contribution to the tourism department, just a couple items on that. If the committee wants to make a recommendation on that, I suggest you make a motion and do that so we can share that with the council. Mm-hmm. That is what the T-bid board discussed 2 weeks ago. A week ago.
They were on 75K.
They recommended
Yeah.
75. The funding amount is based on resolution. $60,000 is the base amount plus 20% of TOT revenue in excess of $3 million. So our recommendation, our placeholder of 60,000 was down to the base amount. Mm-hmm. The city council will hear both T-bid's recommendation if this committee makes a recommendation in May at that first budget study session to give us some guidance on moving forward. would note that this T-bid is really outside the scope of this committee. This committee is Measure Q, but we could share that recommendation with the council if you'd like. And then I'll let the city manager address anything further.
So, good points about measures. Economic development is squishy, as everybody knows, and being able to determine to the extent what one project has on revenue streams that are significant amount, it's hard to dial in that specifics, but the point is well taken. In considering the ombudsman position, I'm going to be talking to some of my colleagues who've pursued a similar method of contracting for that support. You know, as this committee may be aware, the deputy city manager was the kind of the designated economic development position for the city, and I was here 2 weeks when that individual left the city, and we cut that position mid-year that same year, and so it's me in the city manager's office. We've approached the economic development as a team with tourism, planning, harbor, and myself, and some assistance from the chamber, and we found that while we can generate some really good ideas, implementation is challenging when you're talking about directors and the city manager. So we do need assistance in taking some of these ideas into implementation mode. So we'll try to see what we can come up with measures, but the hesitation and how far you go with that is how can you determine to what extent something that's small in nature, what impact it has, but it's still an important discussion.
Okay, thank you. Any thoughts from the members up here? So it's difficult for me. I sat on the one for the first thing, the 60K, or for the giving to all the little, this last year, and they were all good causes. It does beg the question that there could even be more good causes. I know of other organizations in the community do a lot of good volunteer work, so it's not to say that that's not a good cause, but I think Mr. Alexander brings up some good points in terms of admission. And the other thing is, when I look at some of the challenges we have with the pension liability, the ongoing, and also the streets, and I guess maybe you could take some draconian budget moves and say, hey, until those streets get up to PCI 65 or 70, or until you get your emergency reserve at a higher level or something, maybe some of these nice to have things have to be, put on hold for a while. I'm not in a leadership position, but I think this committee can maybe just make some general recommendation that let's give this some more serious, consideration. So that's kind of where I would be on it. None of them, I know a lot of cities do that, have, a discretionary fund and they give it to different things, and so maybe the community still wants to do that. I look at, if you don't make small changes along the way, you're never going to get to where your goals are in terms of being fiscally sustainable. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. John, or based on any of you other, Bart, any thoughts? Or do we make a recommendation? I can include it, or do we not? Do we say, hey, this is something to give serious thought to, but
I can't say that I totally followed all of the examples that Homer gave, but I have a lot of respect for him understanding what the subject is. Mm-hmm. And if we maybe to put something in a motion for another meeting or not something, I would like to hear more about it, because his concepts are certainly very strong. Mm-hmm. And, using the example, I don't know all the details. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Homer is very into this, but in listening to the concept where he's coming from, it seems like it has a lot of merit.
I know in some of the discussion we had, some of the people said, well, maybe they're not supportive of a leprechaun crawl or whatever the thing is. No matter what you do, somebody will think it's good and somebody will think it's not so good. And I agree, it's difficult, even on the economic development things, to calculate your ROI unless you want to go hire some consultant, spend $5K to see where $4K went,
Right. I would The T-bid is going to take this up. I
Okay.
think they had a really healthy discussion. It was the annual stakeholder meeting and then the T-bid meeting last week. So we were talking super high level down to this discussion about a pot of money that's, in the grand scheme of things, pretty small, but nonetheless generates a lot of discussion because there's a lot of policy, wrapped up around this. Should we be funding community events with a tourism dollar? Does that make sense? Should we be funding for-profit ventures? Or should we care about any of that? And if this is really about tourism, should we be creating a strategy that tries to attract a new event and we spend that whole dollar amount on generating something that's going to fill hotel rooms when we most desperately need them, not the month of July, but the month of January. I mean, the Bird Festival is a perfect example of a multi-day. I mean, all the hotel rooms are filled, and you can feel the impact. You can measure the impact. So that's kind of the realm that T-bid will be grappling with, and I think City Council will also as well. I mean, it's sort of been in the T-bid realm, but I think ultimately City Council will be having more of a say in this matter. I have a feeling. Yeah.
So I think what you're saying is really this is an issue that this committee really shouldn't be taking up.
I mean, I wouldn't put it on a future agenda item, but I think that's not to say your input isn't important. But we would take the ideas from this and move it forward to council and T-bid, but I wouldn't, you already have a pretty full plate as it is for a committee. That's my suggestion.
Well, I would just say that I have almost no knowledge about this subject, so I certainly don't feel qualified to weigh in on it as a member of this committee. I mean, if something was provided to us ahead of time that we could study and we were tasked to do it, I would do it. But it sounds like between the T-bid and management and the city council, this issue is handled.
I agree with John.
Okay, so basically, go ahead, Homer, it's our ideas, and they will be taken into consideration. Go ahead.
As I said, I was on a soapbox, so I didn't expect anything to come out of it, so I was pleased that at least one person agreed. I have one final thing about the budget. It has to do with head counts. And I think that we all ought to congratulate Joe Mueller for doing something I've never seen before. He's reduced staff voluntarily. And I think he needs a gold star for doing that because I've never seen that in the public sector.
Relative to the overall budget deficit, a suggestion would be we know this is a continuing escalating issue. Many of these ideas look to be they'd carry over as far as they're not one-time savings, they'll keep going, I think. But to say, okay, what is the thought for next year and the year after, rather than literally coming up every year and saying, well, am I running for office or not? I guess I don't have to worry about it. I'll let the next person worry about it. But to basically have some thoughts as to how we're going to address the, near term, maybe not 10 years, but, maybe the next couple of years, what's going to happen to sort of get people understanding that they're not going to get all these nice to haves, whether we get into the weeds of the T-bid or some other issue, but there's hundreds of thousands of dollars going forward that we're going to have to find and not do something that somebody wants. In fact, when you ask for doing stuff, you get things to add, right? You don't get suggestions on what we don't really need to do. So anyway, maybe a sub-discussion of how this is going to be addressed for future budgets, at least conceptually at a high level.
Yeah, thank you. I think we spend a lot of time putting together the transmittal letter that's from the city manager and the approach to that letter and talking about our future challenges and what we need to start doing to plan for those. And that's a combination of revenue enhancements or diversification and expenditure reductions. And that involves community engagement, conversations, services, what are our priorities? So those are going to be council identified priorities moving into the next couple of years as we try to balance the long-term structural deficit that we have.
And I'll just jump on that. we know we have a structural issue, and this isn't the first time you've heard it. This committee's heard it several years running, and you've heard it from us now. This is the second year for our budgets that we've put together for council. Quite frankly, having the capacity of your council staff and the community to take something on like this I think we're sort of getting there. The Wharf project is moving into implementation mode, and that sucked up so much of our community's capacity, and our council's capacity and your staff's capacity. Such an important issue. Some agree, some would say we didn't get it right, some would say we did get it right, but the bottom line is that discussion has sort of moved on, and now we're in implementation mode, which provides the opportunity to have that big, important discussion about the long-term viability of this community. What does that mean? And Bart's right. I mean, you could ask people what they want, they're going to tell you what they want. Typically it's more, not less. So, it's all about how you frame the discussion to allow for good input. But long-term, we will need work on both sides. But I will add, we've been very cost conscious. There's things that we can't control, like PERS, and Jen and her team have done an excellent job, and even within that, things we can't control, making it manageable. But we are at that point where the ratcheting up is going to continue year after year, and we can't make these kind of small moves any longer. It's going to have to be bigger things, and that requires capacity in our community to deal with that.
Well stated, thank you. And I just had one other quick comment. I had asked a question on C77 from the fire department on the insurance services about explaining the chart at the bottom, and I think the answer was a very thorough answer on the mutual aid reimbursement chart. So I'm not going to ask you to explain it again, but the reason I bring it up is I think it's very noteworthy that because of the tracking or the ISO rating, that affects all of the homeowners' insurance rates. And it was kind of buried in here, so I wanted to bring that out. I didn't understand the chart at the bottom, but I thought the last bullet about the extra savings the citizens get, 60 to 62% since 1996, and then maybe 10 to 12% on an annual premium. And as you know, insurance companies do, just like they do with auto insurance and everything, rate on a whole lot of factors, but this is very good for commercial and residential. So thanks for including that. I'm still not sure about that chart on the bottom and all those numbers. If anybody understands that and wants to take a 30-second stab at that, that'd be great. Welcome and thank you.
Good afternoon. The chart on the bottom on C-77 basically explains, like you said, the ISO rating. So what's really important about the ISO rating, this company goes around every 5 years to all the fire departments and gives a rating of that department, which is their water capacity, their communications. Mm-hmm. Even the ladder truck brought our rating down quite a bit. So the lower the number, the more savings is to the residential and to the commercial community in the fact of a premium. So I think the chart on the bottom shows, on the far right side, it shows 96. We were up at an 8 or 9 rating, and now currently we're at a 3. So,
oh, I see. Okay.
So it kind of goes right to left instead of left to right.
Okay.
And then you'll see on the very bottom it shows a 1, a 2, and a 3, and you can see we're right at the 3 range.
Okay.
And then there is no ratings between 5 and 9 because that's a kind of a moving target a little bit. Mm-hmm. So it's anywhere from 10 to 15% depending on who's doing the formula in the insurance companies.
Okay. And what do those percents mean under the 3? Is that like other cities, 40% of them have a 3 or?
No, that's the 40% that's less than 100%. So numbers easy. If it was a $100 premium, that means you're only paying $40.
Oh, okay.
On an average and kind of in general as insurance companies.
So it's cumulative?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Sure.
That's good. All right, thank you.
Jennifer, just one follow-up. When will we be getting the paperwork for the capital improvements portion of the budget?
So that'll be in our next publication, again, May 3rd. That's really going to council. You'll have a chance to comment on it in our May meeting, and I'll be sure to send the committee a link to that when we post it online for May 3rd so you can start looking at it early. If we get your binders back, we'll print you copies of the final proposed budget so you can have a hard copy if it's easier for you to look through that way.
Do you want the binders back with the papers with all our notes marked up, or?
So what we did last year was and if you want, you can keep your papers in there. We'll paper clip your noted copies and put the new ones in front of
okay,
it, so you'll
okay.
have both.
I thought maybe it was a test to see who reviewed it, but thank you. All right, anything else? All right, good. That should conclude our comments on item B2. And now, thank you, Eric, for your patience. We are on B3, the review of the WRF Capital Project Update Report.
Excuse me, can I ask them a question first?
Yeah, sure.
This is for Mr. Caceres or Mr. Livick. When can we expect the revised Chapter 8 and appendices K and L to the One Water Plan be posted on the city's website?
Homer, can you just clarify that really quickly? You're looking for the...
Well, the One Water Plan that was approved by the City Council in November, the financial breakdown, the spread of the various projects over the years differed from the one that Mr. Livick presented at the mid-year budget. And at that time, when I asked it, he said that Chapter 8 and the appendices associated with Chapter 8 were in the process of being revised. But the document still is not on the city's websites, and that's a really important document, I think.
What Mr. Alexander is referring to is changes that were made through the rate-setting process to modify the capital projects over the first 5 years to address cash flow situations, to maintain some level of capital improvements while still funding the WRF project. We'll double-check that online copy. We thought we had it right.
I can't find it online. The way I got it was from the City Council's meetings agenda in November, when they approved it. That's the copy I'm using that I showed you the last time, where you and I had that discussion about why our numbers were different.
We'll put a link to where it resides on the website, a little bit easier to find than buried in the Public Works Water Division page.
I looked there, I couldn't find it.
It's in the list of documents available. It's not the easiest thing to find in the world if you don't know where it is. So we'll make sure that we put a obvious link to that on the page, and I'll email you that link also.
What's for the community, that for $700,000 for the report, the community ought to be able to see it.
Yes, I agree.
Yeah, Robin and I did have a chance to take a look at the version that is actually on the city's website after the discussion, and I believe we confirmed that it did have the right information in it. It has the larger CIP tables that were based on the 20-year, and then it has the revised following that coming out of the Blue Ribbon Commission meeting, and that's referred to in both the appendices and in the body of the report itself. So,
well, I know there's interest in the community on when for instance, some of the fire suppression stuff and the sewer lines are going to be replaced, the years and what streets, et cetera.
Thank you. Duly noted. All right, so we are on the review C3. I presume, Eric, do you want to present something or talk or discuss or?
yes, Madam Chair, I was just going to pull that up on the computer really quickly.
Thank you.
It's like Ms. Callaway is going to do that. Madam Chair, members of the committee, Eric Caceres with Crowell Engineers, City's Program Manager for the Water Reclamation Facility Project. Thank you for having me here this afternoon to present our Q3 fiscal year 18-19 quarterly report. We had the opportunity to present this to City Council last night, the quarterly report, and had some additional discussion. And so I'm going to go over some of the components of the quarterly report and then talk a little bit about how we got to where we got to in terms of the quarterly report, and then some of the things that we are going to be producing for City Council and presenting on a monthly basis. In addition to, as I go through this, we received a number of questions from folks on CFAC. So as much as I possibly can, I've incorporated some of the answers to those questions in this presentation. But if I don't answer your specific question, please let me know at the end, and I can address that.
You bet, go ahead.
So we're asking you to receive the March 2019 monthly report, which is our quarterly report for the WRF, and provide any feedback. So the reporting discussion started formally with City Council and CFAC back in February, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of things that were discussed at the February 26th City Council meeting, which led to the development of the quarterly report. We brought some example reports to the council. This one specifically was one that our company is doing for a utility in Denver. We talked about some of the key metrics that we would be measuring in terms of cost, schedule, and then any project-specific activities. In terms of the reporting frequency, we discussed a monthly report that would be a little bit less comprehensive than the quarterly report, and then an annual report with the goal of that annual report really satisfying the needs for the funding agencies. So folks like WIFIA and the State Revolving Fund typically require an annual report. And so that's really the audience for that. And then we also talked about the audiences. So we want something that's going to be useful to council, to CFAC, to WRF-CAC, to the public, and then to the different funding agencies, really geared around towards that annual report. Some of the things that we discussed at that meeting were including key performance indicators or KPIs so that folks could easily track if the project was on budget and on schedule. That was an example of something that you have seen in the quarterly report, and we'll go through what the information that was in the quarterly report here in a second. We also discussed the reliance on dashboards and graphics, and noticeably there aren't a lot of graphics that are included in the quarterly report. Some of those things are in progress, and I'm going to go over some of the progress that we've been making, and those things will be making their way into the next monthly report. So this is an example of what we're going to be using, which is Power BI, a Microsoft application that works in tandem with our SharePoint site that we use to track a lot of the financial information for the project. Some of the input that we received during that February 26th meeting from council in general was they wanted a less comprehensive monthly report versus the more robust quarterly report. There was a lot of talk about an executive summary style, so paraphrasing things that and condensing them into a smaller number of pages. There was a different page number that was given out by different folks, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 pages. Again, heavy reliance on graphics and visuals. There wanted to be an accounting of key accomplishments and challenges, and then a dashboard with the key performance indicators. In terms of financial information, budget to actual specifically for the project itself, and then for the individual consultant agreements or commitments that are currently out there, and then looking at things like cash flow, excuse me, and then reimbursements from the funding agencies when those reimbursements start to occur. So in terms of the monthly report, what I wanted to go through here was some of the key information that was included in the quarterly report that we are anticipating will now become part of the monthly report. So what are the key components of the quarterly report that you received that are then going to be delivered to you and to council on a monthly basis? So the key accomplishments and challenges, again, was something that was mentioned and requested by City Council. In terms of just generally some of the challenges and accomplishments that we currently have going on, in terms of the general program, we're moving forward with securing some of the funding agreements, and the path to that is the initiation of the SHPO consultation and coordination. That's the State Historic Preservation Office. We're making a lot of headway with that and is on the critical path for us starting construction. You may have heard some discussions about an addendum to our final EIR required to capture some of the recent changes. We've initiated that process and are working with the SA and our archaeologist and our architectural historian on that. In terms of some of the challenges, this is noted as a challenge, is that and it's impacting our schedule, our construction schedule, is that we've moved the Coastal Commission hearing to July, and originally our plan was to go in April, then it became May, and then because of some issues with the consolidation and the need to have that meeting close to home, that meeting is moving to July, and so that's one of the things that's impacting schedule, and I'll go over that here in a second. Work has been promising on the water reclamation facility itself. We've been negotiating a number of potential change orders or changes to the project with the design build team. These are changes we anticipated, and that process is moving forward, and we'll be going to WRF-CAC and Council here in May. In terms of the conveyance facilities, we've been making good headway on moving forward with the advancement of the design, but some issues with accessing some of the sites that we need to in order to finish our field investigations, our geotech and surveying, and we're working through that now with some of the property owners. Recycle water facilities making good headway, and we have a draft report on the city's website of the Phase 1 hydrogeological study work showing the impacts of the injection process on the water quality in the lower Morrow groundwater basin. Again, some of the access issues are causing us some delays on our pilot well planning and installation, our Phase 2, but we're working through those currently. Some of the additional feedback that we received last night on the key accomplishments and challenges, one was to elaborate a little bit on these and to talk about some of the actions that we're undertaking to overcome these challenges, and then what are the likely outcomes. So if we have a challenge with accessing these properties, what are we doing in order to overcome that challenge, and what could the potential impacts be to that. The next is the project dashboard. Again, this is something that was included in the quarterly report and will also be included in the monthly report. A couple of questions that we received from you in regards to this dashboard in particular is, one, there was a question about the change between the recycle water facilities and the conveyance facilities. So there was a large change in the breakdown of the budget for those two. Essentially, we're just moving money around between two different buckets in terms of a major component of the recycle water facilities. The potable reuse pipeline moved into the conveyance facility project, and so we've reduced cost out of that project and moved it over to the conveyance facilities, and that was reflected in the dashboard. There was one notable mistake in the general program costs, that section 1.4. The target was previously set at 10.5 million, and we're trending towards 11.5 million, and that's in total for general program costs. That includes not only program management, but the cost associated with the additional environmental work that we're doing and some other things. And so those two numbers were transposed there. I also made an additional change in the table that's shown up here on the screen, and this was in regards to a question that I received, and looking at changing the designation for the green, yellow, and red keys there, making the green within 5% of budget, the yellow would be over 5%, 5% over budget, and then red would be over 10% over budget. So I think it's appropriate to say that if we're within 5% of our target budget or below budget, that we should be in the green range, where our current budget is 124.5 million against our baseline of 126 million. Another question that was asked was around contingency.
I'm sorry, when you're done, before you go to the next slide, I have a question. Okay. I was confused, and I think some of us are, on the description under data, when it said total program projected cost versus actual cost to date through 3/31. I think that's confusing and misleading, because then when I look at the column, it says current. Does that mean through March 31st? It seems to be, it ought to read something like total program projected cost versus actual cost as of, or some. It's a little confusing.
Yeah, it's actually actual cost projections as of the end of 3/31. Okay. So based on the cost expended to date and what we think it's going to take to complete the project, we're currently trending at 124.5 million as of the end of Q3.
So it's not the actual cost to date through March, it's the actual cost to date projections. As of.
That's correct. So we can reword that to make that a little bit more clear.
Just something to clean it up a little bit.
Well, and to that point, the 1.1, the target is 77.1, and the actual is 77.9, so that actually looks to me like it shouldn't be green. I mean, there's
Like yellow.
items like that throughout this document. So there are a couple of housekeeping things. It made it difficult to read it.
Okay.
And one of them is the page numbers. So it was unclear whether there were pages missing because many of the even number pages are not there. So I didn't know if I had received the whole package. They appear to all be there, but it did raise that question for me.
And that's one of the things that we're going to change as well, that we'll make sure that when we include it in the staff report, we indicate there's a print version and then there's a electronic viewing version. So in the print version, there's a lot of blank pages if you print it on, if you were to print it double-sided or between different sections, so that the new sections always start on the right-hand side and some things like that. So
Just a housekeeping issue.
It just
Raised the question, that's all.
Yeah, that came up with, when I was speaking with the city clerk as well.
And that's my fault. To reduce the file size, I deleted all the blank pages, not paying attention to page numbers. And didn't realize the confusion that would cause. I apologize.
No worries. Thank you. Go ahead, please, Eric.
Thank you. So a couple, as I mentioned, what the box in gray here identifies some of the changes that were made to what was in the quarterly report versus what we're discussing right now. Again, the financial KPI designations have been modified so that the green is anything within 5%, yellow is anything between 5 and 10%, and the red would be over 10% over budget. And then the general program cost numbers were modified as I discussed. One of the things that came up in City Council meeting last night was we will be adding footnotes to this table to indicate any major changes to the KPIs. For example, the change between the conveyance facilities project and the recycle water project itself. There was a large delta in what those numbers were, and so we'll be adding some description to that table to clarify that.
My general sense in presenting information like this is to make it show the picture that you want it to show, and if there's an issue that needs to be explained, put that in a footnote. For example, right now you are forecasting at or below for all three components, and the total under $1.5 million or something like that. There were some changes relative to what happened, and that's something that I think needs to be explained that hasn't been explained particularly well. But for example, the footnote would show that you've changed money, as we spoke yesterday, and I appreciate your time. We have to be careful about how do we account for sewer versus water, which is another issue you're going to have to address. But I don't think you're really over, and if we pick the nitpick one of the worth costs of 77.1 and 77.9, yeah, you would be using contingency. So I don't understand why it would be over anything at this point, because whatever that $800,000 is, presumably you would have taken out a contingency unless you're truly forecasting the total over. But you don't have a trend program in place, so that's hard to get into.
And per our discussion yesterday, that is one of the things that we're going to include. So just to clarify, the original $126 million budget had a $9.4 million contingency associated with that $126 million. At this point in time, we've moved $2.5 million of that contingency over to the water reclamation facility project, again, to cover some of these potential change orders that we are discussing. Again, we can't make that, we won't make that formal change until after that goes to WRF-CAC and City Council, but that's what we're forecasting, is that we're going to use approximately $2 to $2.5 million initially of our contingency, and that's going to move over and become part of the WRF contract, so that WRF contract would be increased by somewhere around that amount.
So technical, but it's not a contract estimate. Unless you're truly saying, okay, you've got some PCOs for the contract.
Correct.
To differentiate the estimate, because the contract is 65 or something like that.
The contract is
for the work is
67.
77, something like that.
That's correct, and that 77, so the numbers that are included in here are total program cost. We need to also put some clarification around some of these things, because we're looking at When we're talking about 126 million or 124.5 million, we're talking about construction, we're talking about soft costs, so design, construction management, program management. We're also talking about city staff time and those other things. And so one of the things that we did do in this document is in different locations where we talk about different components of each of the individual projects, we reference different numbers. So the overall program cost right now is for the water reclamation facility itself is 77.9 million. But that 77.9 million includes soft costs, it includes staff time, it includes the 67 million, it includes the 2.5 million that we anticipate is going to be added to that contract, and it also includes a remaining component of the contingency as well. So we refer to 77.9 in this document, and then later in the document we also talk about 67 million, which is the actual contracted amount that we're also tracking, the construction costs. Any other questions on this? Next.
Any questions up here? All right, go ahead, Eric, thanks.
Thank you. So again, this is the detail of the actual 124.5 million and what's been expended to date. So to date on the program, we've expended about 8.5 million. This is going back to March of 2013 through end of Q3 of this fiscal year. In terms of these individual columns, I'll just explain these really quickly. The one furthest to the left, the actual expenditures to date, are expenditures to date for both city staff and any existing commitments that the city has for contracts. The total contracted cost is what is currently out there in terms of contracts that the city has executed, and that's about 75.3 million. To date, the city has expended about 9.3 of that total contracted cost. So of 75.2, the city has spent 9.3 million of the contracted cost that it has to Carollo, to ESA, to Felance, Black and Veatch, and the other firms. Total projected cost is taking the actuals and forecasting out what we think we're going to be at completion, which is the 124.5, and how much have we expended on the program based compared to that 124.5 is the 6.8%.
Does the actual to date include back to January of 2013?
It goes back to when the accounting started back in fiscal year 12-13. I want to say that the first month was March 2013 is when the first charges were tracked there. Just a couple of other questions to get into a little bit more detail here on some questions that we received. Some questions were asked about what was the current budget up to this point. It was about 40 million was the projected budget through the end of this fiscal year. Right now, we're planning to spend approximately 5.5 million for fiscal year 18-19 versus a 9.4 million that was budgeted for this fiscal year. Another thing to mention here, and this a number of questions came about this, and this was discussed earlier, the financial information that's being presented is just for the water reclamation facility project. So while the Prop 218 process and the rate study covered both the water reclamation facility and a number of capital projects on the water and sewer side, the 124.5 and all the information included in this report is specific to the water reclamation facility. Making a little problem here with the projector real quick. Thanks, Joe. One of the things that was noted as well, and we made this change, is the column that's contracted expended to date was shown as dollars, and that's now percentage. We're also going to be showing the current versus planned expenditures. So this is something that was included in the quarterly report and will come up in the monthly report as well. There was a couple of questions that were asked around this particular figure. The red line represents the $126 million baseline and the spending that we had anticipated when the rate study was completed. And the the new blue line is really from now until the end of the program, how we think the money is going to be expended. So one of the things to note is that the duration of the expenditures is pushed out to around July of 2022, and the previous budget had shown things being expended in about May of 2021. One of the reasons for that change is the budget that was put together, the $126 million budget, was based on, was done prior to bringing the design build firm online and working with them to figure out what the overall construction schedule was going to be. So part of the reason for the shift is a little bit of a difference in the way that the construction schedule is laying out for the different components of the project, so things push out a little bit. The other thing is we worked out some of the details around the main portion of construction ends quite a few months before the final construction. And that's a little bit confusing, but essentially we have substantial completion deadline in November of 2021. That's essentially when the city will be in full compliance with the time schedule order. But then we have some punch list items and some things that need to be completed to have the project finally complete. And then the other thing that we worked into the agreement with the design build firm is we actually have it's a little bit over a 7-month period where the city's going to operate the facility. Black and Beach, Phelos Black and Beach will still be involved, but we'll operate the facility. And then there's a 6-month prove-out period for the O&M costs. So one of the things the design build firm is going to be on the hook for the long-term O&M claims that it made in its proposal. And so that is now factored into this schedule. There's not a lot of money that's being expended on the tail end of the project, but that's now accounted for in the schedule and in the cash flow.
Just to be clear, what does that red line, which was the budget, say should have been expended through this fiscal year, which ends?
Approximately $40 million, based on, that was going back to the budgets from 12-13 all the way through 18-19.
Okay, so the budget we had then, we thought we'd spend 40 million by this time, and where do you think we're going to be at this time?
Where we're going to be at this time is approximately 10 million. So we're expected to spend approximately another 1.5 million between, in Q4 of 18-19.
So I just wanted everybody to understand, there's 40 million that we thought we were going to do, and now we're at 10 million.
Correct.
And also the line up on top, the red line, say it's horizontal, that fundamentally the meaning of that is you're done when you spend all the money.
Exactly. Yeah. So the construction, we had that ending and the total program ending about a year prior to, or expenditures being done a year prior to. Now that with the change in construction date, the revised construction schedule, and then that whole O&M prove-out period, the final completion period, that's what's pushing it out, that roughly another year.
And just to note, the requirement is to have this complete by 2023 in order to match our time schedule order that's hanging over us that, if triggered, could lead to $50,000 a month fines. Maybe not that much, but that's the limit they could hit on us. So we would, according to this new schedule, which is delayed, as Mr. Beckman points out, and there's some justification for that, but nonetheless it is behind where we thought we would be. We're still ahead of schedule to meet the TSO.
Thank you, Scott. So in addition to that, there was some, again, just to clarify a couple of things around this schedule. Originally, construction was anticipated to start for the water reclamation facility in April. That was what the April 29th was what's in the design build contract or the design build agreement. We're now forecasting that construction will start in with a notice to proceed for construction the first week of August of this year, with site work starting the beginning of September. We've got a lot of questions on this schedule, and we are continuing to work to figure out a better way to depict the milestone schedule. Our current schedule is about a 530-line schedule, so those are all the activities that we're currently tracking. And we're trying to find the best way to be able to show going back to 2012, it's about it's going to be about a 10 or 11 year process that we're trying to show in the schedule and show the right information, the right milestones. One of the things that we've discussed is maybe including the full schedule as an appendix to the quarterly report, so if folks can see every single line item there if they want to. But we're also working to clarify the schedule a little bit more. The key date to really take away from this is, and this was something that was asked and something that Scott just clarified, is the time schedule order requires the facility to be done and producing water in accordance with the discharge permit by February 28th of 2023. Our current schedule shows construction being complete, substantial construction being completed, which is the link to permit compliance, November 11th of 2021. In addition to the Gantt chart schedule, we have a milestone schedule to track some of the critical dates in terms of construction start and construction end, and then the all-important permit compliance date. And we're working to kind of clarify and maybe add a couple of different milestones to this list to make it a little bit more helpful. But construction start and end was something that was mentioned by council and by other folks in terms of what they wanted to see in these reports. And so, like I said, we're tracking 530 different items in the schedule. We can include as many as we need to make it clear for folks that are reviewing this. There was a question about some information that was presented in Table 10. I noticed a couple of errors there that had to do with the conveyance facilities project and some of the dates associated with that. We've cleaned that up, and that'll be reflected in the next monthly and/or quarterly reports. So in addition to some of the things that I highlighted as we went through here, we had some additional direction that we received last night from council. Really want us to answer three main questions on the monthly report, which is completely understandable, which is project on budget, is a project on schedule, and what are any of the upcoming obstacles that we're seeing as we're moving this forward. One of the questions that was asked is to add a link to the website. So one of the things that we're going to be including, again, is we're working on our Power BI graphics that'll be accessible through the website so that folks can get in there and get into another level of detail in terms of what they want to see on the website.
Just a clarification, it's not only obstacles to the project, but obstacles that the community might facing in navigating around the project as we construct the conveyance system. So construction impacts, road closures or road slowdowns, we'll have those items listed also.
And then the final piece is a list of acronyms at the beginning of each report, just to make it more clear. We define acronyms one time, and in a 20-page document, we could reference something on page 1, and by the time we get to page 19, it's hard to remember that SHOP stands for the State Historic Preservation Office. So we're going to be doing some things to help the reader navigate these documents a little bit easier. In terms of some of the upcoming improvements, again, these are things that are going to be featured in the next monthly report and then also going to be featured on the website. That we're excited about is the Power BI graphics. These are some of the latest that we've developed currently for the project. But you can go in here and you can click on different bars and turn on and turn off different buttons to be able to see different parts of the project and how things are trending. So you'll notice up here, that's the $124.5 million that we're currently projecting for the completion of the project, and you can break it down and see it, the individual components of the project, how much we anticipate to spend for the rest of the fiscal year, and it's interactive in that way. The other component that is also maybe not easy to see here on the screen, but will be easy to look at, is the different commitments. So we're managing roughly a dozen different consultant contracts currently. You'll be able to see how much has been spent against the contracted amounts for each of those different consultants, which was something that was asked for by members of council and by members of CFAC previously. Again, we're asking you to receive this report and provide any additional feedback at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Very good. Okay, maybe start on the right. Questions, comments, or any feedback, and we can discuss some of this.
I wanted to ask some questions about earned value. I'm not an engineer or project manager. It's a new concept for me, so if you could explain the concept of earned value and how you're using earned value to manage and track this project, and where in this report would I find a measurement of earned value for each of the three segments of this project?
We're currently working on getting the earned value calculations into there so that you can see that. Essentially, earned value is a measure of the actual percent complete versus actually what's been invoiced by a particular consultant. For example, we have a contract for $100,000 with a deliverable tied to that. So for $100,000, the conveyance facility designer is going to give us a set of plans and specs that we can then take into the field, and we can bid that project. So if they've expended $20,000 against that $100,000, they've essentially expended 20% of the budget, but their percent complete may only be 15%. So they've actually expended more than what they've actually completed. And so that the difference between those two that's the measure of earned value. So an earned value of less than 1 would indicate that you're over budget, or you will be over budget on something. One of the interesting things in terms of the way that a lot of our contracts are written, however, while earned value is important and you can look at it for certain things like professional service contracts, the city has time and material not to exceed. And so at the end of the day, if you have a contract for $100,000 with a certain individual to produce something, if it takes them $150,000 to do that work, the city only pays $100,000 and still gets those plans and specifications. So there is a little bit of a nuance there, but we are working with particularly the designer for the conveyance facility so that they're reporting earned value on their contract. And then we're also working, we will be working with the recycled water facility designer when that person is brought on board, and they will be reporting earned value. It's difficult to report earned value on construction because, again, the city has this facility, as currently envisioned, will cost $67 million. And so even if the contractor has done 20% of the work and is trying to get paid for 20, and it's also based on progress payments at that point as well. So construction is not really an easy one to be able to benchmark in terms of earned value.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, earned value, if you have a total maximum price, earned value is not as important of a measure as if you have, well, any contract, you're going to have a maximum price, which is subject to change via change orders.
That's correct. Yeah. So
I guess I'm not really understanding
it is
the value of that measurement is.
Again, it's something that we don't track it for every program. We don't track it for every project that we do on other projects. It's something that sometimes folks ask for. To be able to understand if you are tracking on budget. But again, at the end of the day, that designer or that consultant is on the hook to give you a certain product for this amount of money. So the earned value should always be one, but it is good to understand, again, the health of the work that they're doing.
Is earned value a way to measure progress on the schedule? Make sure you're staying on schedule?
You can also do SPI, which we're also looking at that, and so we're taking the budget and looking at that on a time basis. And this goes back to Mr. Beckman's point. It's a way to be able to understand if you're spending money at the rate that you're supposed to be spending money. And so you can time weight your budget and get a measure of an SPI. And again, a similar thing if your SPI is Schedule Performance Index. So if you've got a Schedule Performance Index of 1 or greater than 1, that means you're essentially ahead of schedule. And so we're also looking at weighting and cost loading our schedule to be able to track SPI or Schedule Performance Index as well.
I brought this up because it's mentioned in the staff report that that's one of the measurements in this report, and I didn't see it. In fact, I had to go on the web and to get some kind of a definition of what earned value actually is, which I kind of partially understood, but not completely. But we're being asked to evaluate, do a financial evaluation of this project, and I'm wondering if earned value is something that we, as a committee, would need to be able to do that financial analysis, because I would think that earned value would be it'd be a measurement to tell you not only how much you've spent, but also where you are with the schedule, which I think both of those things are pretty important. In fact, I think a lot of what's in this report is important to be taken into consideration as a whole, not just pulling out some portion of the financial part of it and looking at that, because that's not going to tell you the whole picture about where the project's at. If the project is on budget but it's not on schedule, that's a major concern. It has to be taken into account as a whole, in my opinion.
That's correct. And so hopefully the schedule performance index, when we get that into the monthly report, that will be helpful, because you will be able to see how things are tracking in terms of schedule. And then again, for earned value, I think the most important thing there will be, for any design contracts, we'll be able to track that. Individual contracts. I don't know if we'll be able to track, the whole project in terms of earned value, because for a construction project, the earned value is going to be one all the time, essentially.
Thanks, Dave. Good points. Go ahead, Lois.
I have a question about retainage and whether or not there is a provision for that. I didn't see any mention of it.
We do have, the only element that we currently have retainage on is for the design-build contract, and we have a 5% retainage. So the numbers that are shown in this are total invoiced, not less retainage. So this is total invoiced. We can also include something about the amount of retainage and track retainage, if that's something that you'd like to see.
Well, I think it does kind of inform the financial picture.
Sure.
And then secondarily, because the penalty is so large for not hitting the target, is there provision in the agreement? Does the builder have any penalty for not performing on time?
There is a schedule for construction, and there also are liquidated damages that are associated with that. I don't have the specifics of that, but those are in there. The interesting thing for a design-build project is the clock really hasn't started on construction, because we haven't started construction, and so we have this phased start. So we've started and issued a notice to proceed for design, but when we do end up issuing a notice to proceed for construction, then the clock will start, and we will have a duration that's associated with that notice to proceed.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like at this point, part of the delay is really on our side as opposed to the builder's side. But I've seen these, they become debatable when you really get into the project.
Yeah, the design builder as well as the city has every incentive, since they have a fixed price, every incentive to start construction absolutely as quickly and finish construction as quickly as possible, because they have escalation working against what they currently have in their agreement. But we will have, once we start construction, there is a very defined construction duration that they will be held to, and any changes in that would be something that would be negotiated at that point in time. If that were to have to change because of anything that would happen on the city's end. But yes, we will be holding them to a construction schedule with liquidated damages.
Thank you.
I don't have any questions.
Yeah, I just have one, Eric. Under 6.3 funding status, there's no mention of the SRF loan.
That's a great question. We are anticipating any day now, and I see Rob is probably going to do a refresh on the SRF page, that we were going to find out if we're going to be on the SRF fundability list. SRF has been telling us that was going to be the beginning of April of this year. As of last week, our contacts there said it's going to be Tuesday of this week, and then they said if it's not Tuesday of this week, it'll be Friday of this week. So we're anticipating that we're going to see that any day now.
no updates on their page yet.
Okay, I'll try to keep my questions few. This is my wheelhouse, what I did for 40 years, so. First, you talked about a quarterly report, it's minor, but the report I've got says monthly. What's the difference? Was there another report that was called quarterly report?
We'll make a distinction between the report for each third month will be called the quarter. This is the quarterly report, so
Okay.
it will be.
I mean, the one I got says monthly.
It says monthly, yes, absolutely.
Okay, so
Yeah, but
it says monthly, but it's really quarterly?
there'll be in the off months.
All right, I'm
and
just saying that you keep calling it quarterly, but the title is monthly.
That's
like
correct.
The first word in the report. Getting to Homer's point, the concept of why we have in our rates $14 million for sewer and water improvements that were never done, which is a little disconcerting, quite frankly, for ratepayers that were paying for work that wasn't done. We now have another set of work for One Water work. The reason that I recall it was given is why we weren't starting on any work, and that's another 11 million, by the way. It's not like there's 11 out of the 14, it's like the 14 went away, other than it's in rates. It's not you, Eric. But we were given an integrated schedule. So where is the integrated schedule so that we can track what was approved in the 218 vote? So if it's not Crow, that's fine. I'm not trying to say it ought to be you, but it seems like the city ought to have an integrated schedule and visibility of the other work.
And you'll see those as we put together the capital budget sheets that will go into our operating capital budget. So we have individual budget sheets for the projects that we'll be taking on in the next.
Okay, so the work that was approved in the 218 is clearly going to be clearly identified, because I think we're already slipping. Again, and the concern is we didn't do the 14 million, and it kind of, got absorbed into a way to reduce what looked like the increase. And now the same thing seems to be happening. So I think there ought to be an integrated schedule, or a schedule. And so I have the benefit of something that the others don't, and that's this detailed schedule. I think it was misrepresented a little bit about the 500 and something line items. I would say 70 to 75% of those are items that have been done, in the past. So if you strip those out, and I started looking at those, and I've got a lot of detailed individual questions on some of the way it's organized and the titles of the groupings and all that, which I'll get away from. I won't get into now, but I do think a schedule with detail needs to be there, because the council, had they had some visibility of schedule, if we go back to that red line of when the 218 was approved and where we are now, we basically have slipped a year from that red line, and a project report would have been telling them, look, we're not on that schedule. Now, the answer is we don't have to be done until the 2023. Okay, fine, but still relative to the schedule that was part of the 218 view, we're a year behind, and the city council, since they didn't have any report, really weren't aware of that. The good thing is there is now a report. We can make these comments. So I think the schedule ought to be there, but I would basically have the items that are in the future. Historical perspective is fantastic, because at some point somebody's going to say, when did we do this or when did we do that? So having that is a good idea. But the 500 line items you're managing, I don't think is exactly what you're doing, since so many of those are 2018 or before times. So now going forward, there's a lot of detail on these things. What's the best way to interface with Corolla?
So I'm a little confused what you're talking about, all the detail that the rest of us haven't seen, so maybe, okay, well, that's nice, but it's also nice if we all get to see that and comment on it and question. I'm not following this 14 million disappearing, Zach. Can somebody or whatever he's saying about that on the capital projects.
The rate increases in 2015 included set-asides, if you will, for capital projects that addressed at the high-level needs in the water and wastewater system, plus money for a not designed but conceived Cayucas Morro Bay joint plant, which was $75 million at the time, and we had about 57 million of that. As we went through the process of the 218 and met with the Blue Ribbon Commission, discussions with community members in forums and one-on-ones and other informal settings, cost and affordability was paramount. So the work was done to do what we could to create reasonable rates. Thankfully, we've landed on rates that at least put us in market with our neighbors. Certainly high, all of us are high, no doubt, but that's part of living where we live. It doesn't excuse it, but it does explain it. So back to this, the 2018-218 includes $11 million for projects for the next 5 years. That's less than what was part of the 2015 rate increase. And we recognize that those projects were never fully developed, nor were they done. We just identified the needs. The One Water Plan actually identified the projects. Now we're moving into implementation. We've identified 3 major projects that we will move through design next year and complete those 3 major projects, which Rob can talk about if this group is interested in, complete within the 5 years as was outlined in the budget and the 218 process. So that sort of gets to that question now, whether the committee is interested in having a significantly detailed schedule. I don't know if that's necessarily the purview of this committee. I mean, Mr. Beckman has been extremely helpful in educating me as a new city manager and kind of helping oversee this project. He's been really insightful and had questions that are drilled down further and wanted to see that schedule, which we obviously can make available to anybody. Not necessarily sure, given what this committee's been asked to do by council, if that's appropriate for us to go down to that level. But that's just my opinion.
Let me comment real quickly on the schedule for the One Water Plan issues. Start and end are fine.
Yeah.
So if there are 3 or 5 items, that's 6 dates. So I don't think that's asking for a lot, just to make sure where we say we can do and we can do it. The $150 a month, just to get back to 14, the $150 a month rate, which was the base rate that we talked about, included $14 million allowance for improvements. So the 150 was a base that included 14 million.
And this is this is a 2015 to 18 rate.
Right. So what we said was the base rate of $150 included $14 million worth of work that was never done. We then
But those amounts went to the accumulation funds, they didn't just go away somewhere else.
We collected money for it.
I understand.
I'm just saying that, but we said what we were going to do with the rates, $150 a month, was going to build a plant and do $14 million worth of these improvements. Well, that's what I recall.
No.
That's not accurate.
I mean, the project was $75 million at the time. It's
That's right.
$126 million.
And we were only paying $56 million of that because somebody,
Right, so
Yeah.
that's obviously a huge explanation of that, and the cash reserves have been maintained. That money didn't disappear. It's going to.
that's right, that's what I want to clarify, yeah.
But
Yeah, it
Bart's
didn't
point,
get done, but.
Bart's point is well accepted,
okay.
that there was discussion about very significant need on our water and wastewater system outside of the wharf. It's been years. We're at the point now where we're at least designing 3 major needs that will address the most, I guess I&I is one of the major drivers of some of our issues, and that these 3 projects would address the biggest needs in that realm.
I don't disagree with Bart when it comes to some sort of integrated schedule. I know at our meeting in February where we discussed the mid-year budget, there was a capital project addition for a couple items. And I understand from the sewer side that you don't want to start tearing up Main Street to replace that line until you do the conveyance system. That makes common sense. But to the best of my knowledge, the city council has yet to see any RFPs for any water projects. And some of those there's some fire suppression issues in some of those, and the money's there, and so some of those should at least get started, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And I do think there should be some sort of way to, I don't care if it's us or PWEB or the city council, but some way to track those projects that are in the One Water Plan, that are in the current rates, how those are progressing.
Absolutely.
Does that capture your
Yeah.
thoughts?
That is it's spot on, both of you, right? And I wasn't talking about not bringing an integrated schedule back. I just mean the 500 line item, which we understand many are historical, but that was what I was talking about. But PWAB and council definitely, what we're trying to do is create a 5-year capital plan, which we don't have. The One Water Plan is a really good template for that for the city writ large. And moving forward, utilizing PWAB and their expertise to review CIPs throughout the year. The commitment will be to get into design where you would start to see RFPs for these major projects. Of course, we have to do them sequentially and understand how they work together, and also address some of our deficiencies on the staff side within the Public Works Department, how we can facilitate those and look at different models, because they're at full capacity at this point. So those things are all going to be addressed in tandem. The commitment is to complete those 3 major projects, which have fire suppression-related issues within the 5 years.
Thank you. I think that explains it better. Thanks. Okay, so is there anything, John, did you have anything else? Did we cover everybody, Bart? All right, so you got our comments on this, and I think that's very similar to what we heard last night and that, so we're okay with that. So any further discussion on B3? All right, so that brings us to B4, future agenda items. And let's see.
Can I make a comment on B3? I wasn't quite done. So what are we being asked to do today with item B3? We're being asked to receive the report, provide comments. There was also, in the staff report, it mentioned something about pulling information out of here for what this committee's been tasked with, which I'm not quite sure I understand what we're supposed to be doing with that. But my understanding is the council wants us to do a financial review of the wharf project. Am I understanding that correctly?
A high-level financial review or comments when these monthly and quarterly reports come to us. That's what I understand, not an oversight.
That's the general charge provided by
Correct,
council.
not an oversight, but a review. Mm-hmm. And are we going to be reviewing the entire monthly report and quarterly report? Or are we going to be reviewing a portion of it? Because there's a lot more in here than just the financial end of it. There's project scheduling and a lot of other information.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Information that might, challenges, et cetera, that go beyond just simple finance. So are we going to be reviewing the entire thing? Or are we going to pull some of this out into a lesser report that we're going to be charged with reviewing?
My understanding is a financial review
Right.
only, not the detailed. Now, obviously, some of the schedule and that affects the finance and the metrics.
That's right.
To answer your
I
question.
think the idea is to give context to this committee. Your charge is specific to the financial, but as we've discussed, and Beckman and I have discussed, and others, it's sort of hard to do one without understanding the other. The same with WRF-CAC, to review engineering, technical components without understanding the cost impacts, right? So I think you look at the whole report, but compartmentalize your kind of comments and concerns around the financial issues. It's not a perfect science. It's not necessarily entirely black and white, but I think at the high level, to take a step back from this committee just into the community, you have now a third you have council, you have this committee, and you have WRF-CAC all sort of looking at the same thing, maybe with specific lenses, but you still, I think, need to see the whole thing to understand where we're moving towards and where issues may lie. But hopefully that helps. But, the overall guidance is that you look at specifically from the financial side.
Okay, so we're going to be looking at the entire report as a committee with our focus on the financial portion of the report, and we're going to be looking at that as a committee the entire committee is going to be looking at that on a monthly and quarterly basis. Those reports, and reviewing them and commenting on them.
Great question. Is this same presentation can be given to WRF-CAC? That may help me understand more of.
WRF-CAC is looking at specific components only. Okay, so.
Technical.
Yeah, right. They're not meeting monthly to receive a monthly report. They're going to be meeting, as was designated from the beginning, as a special advisory committee, not a standing committee, a regular committee, to look at specific components of the project. So next month will be the Black and Beach, Phelong, potential change, the design report and potential change orders. So they're going to be looking at that. And eventually they'll be looking at the hydrology report and maybe a few other things. But otherwise, they're not meeting just to look at a monthly report. But when we present those technical components, they are also going to have to consider the financial implications of such things. Otherwise, they're kind of operating in the dark.
So our focus is going to be to review, evaluate, and comment on the monthly report and the quarterly report.
Right.
The same report that's going to City Council.
That's right. So on the monthly side, and maybe Jen can help me here. On the monthly side, you'd be looking at the more narrowed report, just like council, and then on the quarterly, you'd be looking at the more expanded report. That's what council directed us to do.
Okay,
So
I just want to make sure, I was struggling
Understood.
with what we, as a committee, are being charged with to do.
Right.
And we had talked about forming a subcommittee before.
Right. What council's told has provided the general guidance, reviewing the same reports they review, providing comment and input back, and we can carry forward whether there's recommended changes or there's concerns of note. We carry that message back. Of course, you typically have members of council attending these meetings, but we carry that back to them.
We did talk initially a little bit about, Dave is correct, on the subcommittee, but then Eric, the program manager, came back with some samples of what they've done for other clients that have been well received, and if those are summarized in quarterly and monthly, then why have a subcommittee? I'd like everybody to see that and respond to that, assuming it doesn't start taking 90% of our meeting, agenda.
Since we meet on the third week of the month, will these reports be presented to the City Council at their fourth meeting?
Yes.
Excuse me, second meeting? Fourth week?
Fourth Tuesday, second meeting, yes, of the month.
Okay, great. Does that help, Dave?
It does. There's a sentence in the staff report. Staff in Corolla are seeking direction from CFAC regarding what information they would specifically like to see on a monthly basis in a tailored monthly report.
Right. And
okay, we're not going to be looking at a tailored
there was an error in that because council had it before you, and that's
okay. We're not looking at it. We're not getting a tailored monthly report. We're looking at the entire monthly report, the entire quarterly report. Okay, I just want to.
And I think this evolves as it goes on. We may come back with some comments after we see a couple. Remember, this is
council
initial.
may do the same.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. But I think that the key point in this, again, appreciate Mr. Beckman meeting with us, is what's the story? I mean, you can present all the data you want, but if what are the issues and how are you going to address them? Are we falling behind? What's the trend? I mean, those things are what's going to be most beneficial.
What's the story? What's the big issues? What are you doing about it? Are we still on task, schedule and budget-wise, with our focus being finance? Okay, thanks.
Clear as mud.
All right, now that takes us to B4, future agenda items. Anything from the committee here? I do have one that came from an absentee member. So basically, from Mr. Bose, he asked to put on the future agenda item, and I'd like to hear your input on that, and based on some new information we've received. He wanted, including in the agenda, a discussion of improving communications with Mr. Cesara's program team in WRFCAC and CFAC. And I understand he met with you, Eric, and his recommendation was that we would select one committee member from this CFAC and one from WRFCAC to meet with the program team, and that you thought that might be a good idea. I haven't had an opportunity to discuss it with Eric, but I will say I did notice on the city council meeting last night, there was a whole full agenda item that got delayed to another meeting on improving communication on these projects and other things going on with the city. So my thought is, what do the others think of this? Eric, what was your input? I'm concerned about the subcommittees and the number of people going off and meeting individually. That's why we're trying to get these program reports summarized so that everybody can see them. But I'm open to suggestions. This was just from a CFAC member that thought maybe we should be, moving in a more detailed manner and coordinating with the program management. So I'll leave it for your discussion before we maybe defer to council.
If I can comment, because of Dave's, what he brought up, I think we may be clean relative to the WRFCAC issue. I had the same concern that we talked about, but it sounds like relative to WRFCAC involvement, parse that issue, they're going to be looking specifically at technical things, a geological report. They're going to look at the change orders. Technical. Now, not that there's not a dollar thing, but they're not going to get the project report. So I think unless people in WRFCAC disagree, I think we're clean with them. Now, that leaves the other part of what he said, and I guess I don't know how we least impact you and your time. I'm looking at both of you. And that, I guess, I'd certainly be open to what Bill's getting at. I'm going to certainly continue to have questions like this and more. So whatever the easiest way to do that is, I don't know.
Yeah, subcommittee would be adding more workload to an already strapped program manager and city manager and public works director. We do make ourselves available, though, and again, very fruitful conversations with Mr. Beckman and others who have expertise. But I haven't heard an overriding concern from anybody else about this. So, maybe some of it's just meeting with Mr. Bose individually to catch him up on where we are on things, to make him comfortable with where we're at and how we got here. That's my suggestion.
Okay, thanks. Eric, are you in agreement with that?
Yeah, I think that would work. That would work well.
Okay, and once again, I think some of these reports you're going to do are going to give us some more background. I'm a little bit concerned about, on any committee, all of us individually, well, I want to meet with this staff person and that, and then coordinating the information. Time is money, as we all know, so somehow we have to manage our time and your time. We want to be advisory, we need our questions answered, but I've always been very concerned, and Jennifer has helped us in getting all these questions answered so we can all review them, not just answer them 7 times individually and then try to figure out where we're at. That's the purpose of the entire committee. So, any other thoughts or comments?
I agree with you, Barbara. I think we need to let management do what management does and the engineers do what they do and not trouble them, and meet as a committee and decide things as a committee, not as individuals.
I agree with John. I don't see any value in a 3-person committee.
All right, thank you. Lois, anybody else? Agreed. Okay. All right, so we're not going to put that on the agenda item. I'll thank Bill for his suggestion, and I want to encourage our group to continue to get the reports, and then maybe in the future we may need to have a little subcommittee or do something, but let's do that as a concerted. That goes back to our mission statement on the CFAC, that as the council directs us on the financial issues, we'll review those. There's hundreds of things we could get involved in that some of us may be more interested than others, but that's not the objective or the mission statement statement as I've reread it recently.
Were you planning on writing up a quick summary and sending it to the city council, since we did talk about quite a few important issues today?
I'd be happy to do that, and if you guys want to send me a few bullet things, and I'll try to consolidate it all, or if the committee's okay with that, send what you want. I think I took some notes, but if anybody has anything, I'll be happy to do that and just document it. You guys okay with that? Homer, I know you'll send me some stuff.
Concerned about Brown Act violations and emails being exchanged. Maybe there's a different way to do that.
Welcome. Public comment, open.
It's different standing here. Why don't
Start that clock.
Yeah, why don't I work with our chair? We'll come up with a summary of what we think we heard, and then I'll send it out to the committee, and you can respond to me individually so there's not Brown Act violations. You can include the chair on that response, but no other. So we won't have any Brown Act violations.
Perfect.
Okay. And then for your next May meeting, it's probably going to be very full. We're going to target to have your third quarter investment report, third quarter budget performance report, the rest of the budget in full capacity with the summaries, the capital project, and any revisions to the other pieces that you've already received, and then a WARF report. So have
That'll
some
be
coffee beforehand.
So it'd be a monthly water report, right?
Yeah, lots of caffeine.
Okay. All right, thank you all. All right, I'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you all.